Welcome to episode 29 of the Stacking Habits podcast. We're your hosts, Matthew, Caleb, and David. And today is a different episode. We'll be recapping this first season of Stacking Habits, reminiscing on the previous guests and topics that we had. And we have a surprise announcement near the end of the episode, so make sure you listen all the way through.
Welcome to the Stacking Habits podcast with your hosts, David, Matthew, and Caleb. Our mission each week is to dig into the habits, rituals, and routines of guests who are living life to the fullest. But remember, knowledge without action is worthless. So be sure to take what you hear and put it into practice. Turn these words into works in your own life. Without further ado, let's dive in.
Caleb, so you were saying you were listening to 15 to 20 minutes of each episode?
Yeah, it was really fun to just do the recap. I'd forgotten about some of our guests, and a few takeaways. One, we had some incredible guests, and I know we did the relationship series, but a lot of our earlier guests kicked off, sort of touched on relationship themes as well. And so it was just kind of interesting to see that overall theme permeate throughout it. To Matthew's point about stepping away, I think our best audio episodes were the ones that we recorded in the studio. The way that each of our voices sound when it's professionally mixed and when it's in person was really good. I think all of our voices sound great. And then it's not bad on Riverside, but I think it's a little more garbled, maybe a hair fuzzy. And so as much as it's, not fun to pay for studio time, I think you get a better quality, product as a result.
Yeah, I think probably also a big factor is our ears notice each voice sounds similar, where it's more of a distinction if my audio sounds this way and you have a different mic and different internet and yours just the pitch is all different and everything. And when it's a studio, it all sounds so similar that it feels more like what our ears are used to hearing, I feel like. So we just accept it easier. But yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, the audio definitely does have a big part of it.
I thought that stood out, and
real quick, also just being in person, we've talked about this many times, but just being able to bounce back and forth, the conversation is just a lot more fluid in person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt that as well, where it was easier to jump in without stepping on toes, and I felt like it was a little more lively as a result.
Should we go over those top episodes? I was surprised, actually, just now I pulled it up. Did you look at it recently? It was different than I was expecting it to be.
I did. I'm not surprised because episode 1 was the most listened to, which that typically tends to be the case.
Yep. And episode 0 is more like an intro, but it's second, and so it kind of makes sense too.
Yep. And then, yeah, David, did you look this up, or are you coming in blind?
This is
what's your guess then? Don't look at it. Don't look at it on your computer, David. What do you think number 3 is? So episode 0 and 1 are 1 and 2.
Number 3, my guess would just be, let's see, I would think either Kyle Horn or Brad Rubendale, just because it was earlier on in the season and they both talked about really interesting topics.
It was episode 16 with Aaron Dodge, building momentum through small wins.
I was totally off.
I'm curious if that's because he's promoted it to his audience too, or if it's just something about the title that intrigues people or what that would be. But that one's risen recently because that wasn't up there all the time. But yeah, it's very close to the top 2.
I think it's because we put superpower in the title and everybody likes superpowers. So
make routines your superpower. That is a good title just right there. Even if you don't read on, make routines your superpower. It's like, ooh, I want to know how to make my routines my superpower.
It was good. The next one was an internal sode. It was playing offense. It's one of the ones we recorded down in Phoenix. So it was kind of reflections on 7 years of running a startup. That was a fun episode. It's interesting that one resonated as well.
Was this the one, though? I was trying to figure out when I looked at this list last, which is the one that we blasted off to the list of old customers that randomly got a lot of views because of that email blast? Do you remember which one had that spike?
It could have been that one.
Because there's one of them, I remember we sent out an email to all the past, or not all, but certain past customers. I think it was a tracking spreadsheet it was. And we got a boost on one episode. I just couldn't remember which episode that was.
I thought it was an internal sode. It might have been that one.
Maybe. And then number 5 is Mindfulness in Mason Jars with Adam Dell. That was a really
That
good
one was a
episode.
really good one. Yeah.
I liked
There's
all the
certain
guests that we've had.
episodes.
I really liked
Yeah.
the way Adam Dell was able to speak. I feel like we're all captivated the whole time.
There are certain episodes that stood out to me as being notable, and all our guests were great, and I'm so grateful to have their time on our show. But there were certain guests where I just felt like we got into a groove with, Adam Dell being one of them, where I was like, man, I don't want this conversation to end. I feel like we could go for another 2-3 hours.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think my favorite two, if we had to pick them, were back to back. It would have been Brad Rubendale and then Audrey Wyman. I think we recorded those the same week, but both guests spoke from their heart. I was really dialed into both of them and just enjoyed the conversations. I feel like we were able to dig deep, sort of get past the surface level questions and go right to the heart, right to some of the depth. And I thought both of them just showed up in a big way, and I really enjoyed those conversations personally.
So yours were Brad Rubendale and what was the other one you said?
It would have been Audrey Wyman.
Audrey Wyman.
And it's
what
kind
were
of
your
cool
two, David? Or do you have two that come to mind?
I took down some notes. I really liked Joji's episode a lot. I also really enjoyed Adam Dell's and Ty Walters. It was
Ty
a more
Walters,
recent one. Yeah, that was a good one too.
I was gonna say 8 and 9 were definitely up there for me too. I was gonna say Joji's I really liked because I felt like it was one of the most practical ones we've done, where it's like afterwards I feel like people could listen to that and I listened to that. I'm like, ooh, I want to do this, this, and this. He showed us how to. He showed us what it's done for. It was very practical. It's, hey, here's a step you can take that's easy. Here's a step you can take that's easy, and here's the results it's made. So I really liked Joji's. I think it was really practical. Adam Dell's, like we said, it was just kind of captivating. He was great at presenting his stories and just made me want to listen to him more. And so I really liked Adam Dell's. And then kind of a close second, third was one of the most recent ones we did. Was, let me see what episode it was. It's one of the newest episodes we did. It was the Finding Purpose After Serving with Wes and Chris. I really liked that one because I feel like there's a difference, and this is one of the things we can talk about later, but one of the takeaways I had from it. But between being successful at something and being passionate about something, and sometimes those go together, but they don't always go together. But you can hear it in someone's voice when they're passionate about what they're successful in. And I feel like those guys just talking about their story and the people they've helped and just how they're in service to all these people, like you could hear the passion in their story and their voice and the individual things they've been through and how they've helped other people through those. I really liked that episode too.
And I will give those two fine gentlemen a shout out. I actually followed up with them both on Marco Polo after the episode. Just said thank you for coming on. Really appreciated their time and attention. And we got to chatting and connecting and bouncing ideas. And then they just threw me into their WeBus group. And so it's a group designed specifically for dads, of which I am 6 times over. And so it's really interesting. I've been a fly on the wall in that one. I haven't participated yet. But there's some really incredible men in there that are just doing their best to improve their lives, work on habits. So it kind of fits right in with the podcast, but then just be great, husbands, partners, and dads. And that's been really cool to see because those two were just energetic, outgoing. Like it was super fun to be part of that conversation. And then to follow up after the fact and see that the way that they approach life is exactly how they showed up for the podcast. So
That's
special
really
shout
cool.
out to those two fellas because they're practicing what they preach every single day.
Caleb, you asked us to prepare one key insight or takeaway that we had from season 1 of Stacking Habits, and I jotted down a few notes. Did you want to just jump into that?
That sounds amazing.
All right. Why don't we do this? I'll go first, and then I'll popcorn it off to someone else.
Cool.
That way I don't risk you guys or me saying the same thing as one of you guys, I guess. All right. So I had 3 takeaways from this first season of Stacking Habits, and it really came down to this concept of frameworks. To your point, Caleb, we've been talking a lot about frameworks, but there are 3 almost like habits or, three habits that really stood out to me, overlapping habits among multiple guests. So the first one was the habit of self-awareness. People described it in different ways. Aaron Steinberg talked about, finding your theme, looking inside and identifying your theme. And then Zach Price talked a little bit about it, being able to separate sort of the person from the risk and the behavior. Aaron talked about it in battling through sort of his low periods. But this concept of self-awareness and being able to take a step away from the situation that you're in and being able to identify who you are, where you're at. That was one habit that sort of stood out as an overlapping habit. And then the next one was setting a clear roadmap. Mike McCarthy talked about this in the first episode, setting a goal board, figuring out where you're going to go. Adam Dell talked about it a little bit through his gratitudes, just writing down things that you're grateful for. And then Michael Burdell, his entire episode was on goal setting and habits. And so setting a clear roadmap, that was a second big habit that I took away as an overlap. And then the last one was cadence. It felt like every other guest was really talking about setting cadences to your habits to fortify it and make it more impactful. And so Brad Rubendale, he had an annual cadence of setting his different, I forget exactly what they were called, the 5. Do you guys remember what it was called? It was like the 5.
Was it he had a bucket list thing that he updates. Was it every 10 years? That was a longer one though, wasn't it? It was like every 10 years.
There was a bucket list thing. There was an annual thing. There was an annual habit. Kyle Horn, talked about sprinting every week as his main form of exercise. Megan Allers was talking about sending polos to her friends and family daily. And so I thought it was really interesting that, again, these 3 habits sort of stood out to me as being core habits that a lot of people followed. A lot of these successful people followed.
I love that, David. So knowing who you are, where you want to go, and then kind of having those rhythms would be sort of that cliff notes of the 3 main principles.
Yeah, exactly.
I like it. Matthew, you want to share your takeaways?
So I didn't do 3 takeaways. I did a favorite moment, I did a big takeaway, and then I did an unexpected lesson, the 3 things that I saw you mention there. So I've got a little bit different structure there. I will say, every time you guys keep mentioning sprinting and Kyle Horn, I was going to say, I think about that episode every single time I get out that sprint timer. I don't know if you guys remember, but we're going to do the sprinting challenge. I got that sprint timer off Amazon. And then I used that for myself, but then for when I was helping coach Truett's flag football, we did at the time the kids 40-yard sprint, so we got that back out. And the kids absolutely loved doing sprint timing. And then recently, Truett's friend had a birthday party, and their dad asked me to bring the sprint timer because he wanted to race all of his friends. And so I set that sprint timer back up, and all the friends got to race and sprint each other. And every time I pull that little timer out, it reminds me of Kyle Horn and that episode we did. And so I'm just grateful for that episode and the people we've met through this process. But so I'll do the favorite moment, the big takeaway, and then unexpected lesson, and then I'll hand it over to you, Caleb. So favorite moment was probably just an episode. I really liked our internal episode we did in person in Phoenix. I liked that we just had, even though we had guests that were interviewing that time too, the personal episode, I feel like we could have just gone on for twice as long as we did, 3 times as long as we did. It just flowed. I felt like that episode you came really prepared, Caleb, to kind of lead off that conversation. And I feel like we all just kind of pitched in, and I just enjoy talking with you guys, enjoy going to dinner with you guys and having conversations. And so getting to film that and look back at it and listen to it again is fun. So that was probably one of my favorite moments of the podcast, is that internal episode together in person in Phoenix. The big takeaway, I kind of already mentioned it, but is listening through different guests and stuff like that. Not that we've had a terrible guest or anything like that, but I feel like there is, like we said, there's people that are successful at things, and there's also people that are passionate about things. And sometimes those overlap, but sometimes they don't. Someone could be a great investor, but if they're not passionate about it, they can still be successful, but you can hear it in the way they talk about it. Or there could be people like you just experienced, Caleb, where Warren Buffett's been investing his whole life, and you can tell he loves this. It's what he loves to do. It's what he loves to think about. It's what he loves to ponder. And you can hear the passion. even if he's not over the top in the way he presents himself, you can tell he loves what he does and he puts a lot of thought behind it. And the different guests we have, you can just tell when you get on a vein or you ask a question along the lines of something they're passionate about, you can see like their eyes light up, it clicks on, and they can just start talking about it, versus other questions where you can tell they're answering from a place of experience, but it's not a place of passion necessarily. And then you ask the right question, you get along that vein of something they're really into, and suddenly their eyes light up and you hear that in their response. And so the big takeaway for me was just to, I guess a big takeaway is listening at each guest and hearing the different things they were passionate about, and how you could tell just by listening to them what those things were and how it really shows. And so success is not always in line with passion. Sometimes they go together, but not always. And then an unexpected lesson is it wasn't really the same way with our last podcast, Books and Bourbon, because we had a different format to the show. I feel like we felt it a lot more with this one. But is that you think of a podcast and doing interviews, and you think of interviews as the hard part, or interviews as the thing that takes a lot of time. But in reality, it's finding high quality guests and setting up high quality guests for interviews is the hardest part of a podcast, at least in the initial stages by far. Like the interviews, even though it's the main thing people hear of the podcast, that's the easy part of the podcast. The hard part of the podcast is finding great people to interview and setting up those interviews and everything else that goes along with that. And so I remember, because our process was different for Books and Bourbon, we had a little bit of a different flow for getting guests that came a lot easier. I was expecting just the interviews to be what we took most of our time doing, but finding high quality guests is a difficult thing to do. There's so many people out there, and like you experienced, Caleb, with a post one time, so many people want to be on a podcast. That's not hard to find people that want to be on a hot podcast, but finding high quality guests is difficult. And so that was one unexpected lesson, is just finding high quality people is tough. There's not a ton of high quality people out there. There's a lot of average people out there. There's a lot of people that put on a show that they're passionate about what they're doing or successful at what they're doing, but finding true people that are masters of their craft is difficult to find. And when you find them, you get great interviews, but it's just tough to pick out those people.
Matthew, to that point, if you had to guess a percentage, I want to hear from both of you guys. If you had to put a percentage of like people that would be a good fit to be a guest on this podcast, what would you put that percentage at?
Of like all people everywhere?
Yeah, just like let's just say like people who would like, obviously like more than half the world is disqualified because they can't speak English, right?
It's a very
maybe
small
another
number
half
of people to fit. Yeah. There's like we figured out, looking for guests, there's such a unique bucket they have to fit in. They have to be someone that excels at a certain craft or something specific. They have to have habits or routines around that, and they have to be able to present those in a way that's compelling to the audience. And having all three of those things put together is a difficult combination, at least to identify and find. I'm sure there's tons of people that fit that, but people that we're able to find and identify easily is where the challenge happens, I feel like. I don't know what percentage it would be.
I would say low single digits. I don't know if that's 3 or 5%, but that kind of feels like maybe the upper bounds. And again, my criteria is pretty much what Matthew just said, but it would be intentional people. So people that are living life on purpose. And I think a lot of people just go through autopilot, watch a lot of TV, and they're on their phone a lot, and they're just kind of living life one day at a time with the decisions that, the previous, the past person. So Caleb a year ago made a decision. I'm just kind of following that out. So I think the intersection, that's kind of the popular trendy term, but the Venn diagram of people that are living on purpose, that have had some kind of a transformation, and that are able to sort of engagingly share that on a podcast, I think is a pretty small number.
Yeah. Which makes you like appreciate the, 20 some odd guests that we had this season. It's been remarkable just hearing brand new perspectives. And I feel like we did a pretty good job, like getting a diverse pool of guests and getting different voices on the show.
Yeah, and going back through and listening to every episode, at least, like I said, 10 to 20 minutes while traveling this past weekend, I was like, man, we had some great guests. And even just kind of going back through, I was taking notes again while I was listening. And there was some really powerful points that could really transform your life if you just put one or two things into practice. And I'll share my themes as well. David already took one, but that's the concept of frameworks. And a framework, the way I would describe it, is a frame. So it's a way that you view the world, a worldview or an idea that makes sense to you. And then the emphasis is that it works. So again, all of this stuff is great, but if you don't put it into practice, then a habit, one, it's not a habit unless you're actually doing the thing. But your life doesn't change unless you change your actions or your thoughts or your mindset. But typically it relates to actions. So a frame that works is every one of our guests has a story, and they probably have multiple frameworks that have helped them live a better life or live more on purpose or more intentionally. And when you find something that works for you, I think it's sort of our duty as humans to share that. And that could just be sharing it with a friend, could be sharing it on social media. It doesn't really matter where, but I think it's your duty to say, hey, this was my life before this habit or this framework or this way of viewing the world. Here's my life after. And it's almost like a multi-level marketing scheme, is like you owe it to share it. And then someone else can sort of take the same principle and go, yeah, I'm going to try that. And oh my gosh, it works. And the ones that sort of catch on and then begin to spread sort of create a movement, maybe a cult, maybe a small religion, whatever you want to call it. But I think a framework is kind of an interesting way to look at it. Almost every nonfiction book is somebody's framework for making sense of the world and how to improve their life. And so that's been the really cool part of this. I thought when we started out, we kind of neatly chunk it into buckets like finance and health and business tips or whatever. And in reality, every guest that came on probably shared a half dozen to a dozen frameworks in terms of how they've made sense of the world, how they've applied something that's helped them, and then sort of encouraging others to follow along. So I love that aspect. The second piece that stood out was definitely the value of being proactive and living life on purpose. And we'll have to try and get this guy on. I met him at an entrepreneurship conference, but Justin Donald runs the Lifestyle Investor. He's got a podcast as well. And his podcast is built off the exact same premise. And meeting him and talking with him, he's big in money and trying to set up investments that can lead to passive income. But his whole thing is most people live life on autopilot. They don't make intentional decisions. And so just meeting him, he challenges listeners, I want to say users because I'm from the software world, but he challenges his listeners after every episode, stop before you move on to the next podcast. Write down one thing that you can put into practice today based on what you just heard. And I'm just reminded of that. It's like, man, if I go back and listen to these 29, 30 episodes, there's so much value packed in, but the value will never find its way into my life unless I actually do it. So that'd be number 2. And then we got to have number 3 because you can't have 2 main points. It's got to be 3. I think a trend that came back up, and one thing I've really appreciated with these, and I'm going to go back and do it with some of the guests I haven't yet, is I'm a type 7 on the Enneagram, which means I like to do lots of things and have a wide range of experiences. And so I would rather go to a new restaurant than go to one I've already been. I would rather read a new book than reread an old one. And I think this conversation came up, between you, Matthew, and David in person, but it also has come up with a few of the guests, is the idea of going back and rereading a book. And to me, it's like, well, I've already read the book. I've already gleaned some insights. And I've had some really good books that have changed my life, like Profit First, The One Thing, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. There's so many great books that have been impactful. And I've been challenged, and I haven't done it yet. Even things like Atomic Habits, it's an incredible read. Well, I'm a different person than I was when I read that book, 2 or 3 years ago. So if I were to go back and reread it, or in some cases, like with our guests, go back and connect with some of these guests. And I do that. Some of them are my friends already. Some are becoming friends. It's like, man, there's 20 plus incredible humans that we had on the show. And if we just keep blazing ahead, go to season 2, 3, 4, and just keep trying to find new guests, it's almost a shame because we have an incredible humans right in front of us that we can engage with and learn from and continue to build relationships with. So that's been a really solid piece, not only being proactive, but pursuing depth, not only in ideas and books that have impacted us in the past, but then also with people. And I've been able to reconnect with several of the guests already, and I'm looking forward to continue to go deeper with many of you.
That was so well put. You've got me sort of spiraling down an Enneagram rabbit hole right now, and I was searching up type 7, which is what you are, and I saw type 7's relationships with type 3, which is what I am. And it says, this can be an extremely volatile couple, almost too much electricity under one roof.
Noted.
It's electric.
Do you ever feel that, Matthew? Too much electricity?
Too much electricity in the room at all times. Oh, yeah. Wait, so you're a number 3, David? I pulled it up. I'm trying to look at it.
Yeah, I'm
Matthew,
a type
do you know
3.
yours?
I did a while ago. I forgot what it was. I logged on and took their test not too long ago to see because I couldn't remember. And I don't know if I was sleepy or what, but whatever answer I got, I was like, nope, that's not right. And I showed it to Joy. She's like, nope, not even close. I must have answered some random question wrong or something like that. So
no, dude, that's type 10, the sleepy personality.
The sleepy personality. Oh, type 10 it is.
Yeah,
I see
yeah.
it there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. For some reason, I don't remember. I thought for some reason I was a 3, but I don't think I am. I forget what it was.
What do you guys think of these?
Looking through.
I don't want to get too sidetracked, but what do you guys think of these personality assessments like Enneagram or Myers-Briggs, or there are a handful of them out there?
I love them. And I heard an analogy. I forget where. I wish I could give credit where it's due. But they said there's only so many personalities, whether that's Myers-Briggs or StrengthsFinders or Enneagram. There's tons of them. And I think what they do really well is they kind of describe what type of tree trunk you have. So there's only so many types of people. Like you might be of someone that likes to help other people, or you're trying to perform at your most efficient self, or there's only so many desires and personality traits that are out there. And so there's the core traits, which would be called the trunk. And then there's infinite possibilities in terms of how your branches and your leaves and your twigs develop. And so I think it's really helpful to have a rough idea and go, man, I'm a helper of people. So when it comes to trying to pick decisions, I want to generally stay in that vein. But in terms of how I show up in the world, I think there's infinite possibilities. But it does help to know that you're an oak tree versus a sycamore tree.
Interesting.
I like that. I think they're a really good starting point. I think personalities in general are a spectrum, but I think if you look at a spectrum and think of it like this, there's definitely little buckets people can fall into, and it definitely helps to know if you're over here and someone's way over here. Doesn't mean you guys are going to perfectly fit everything in there, but it is a very good helpful starting point to know where somewhere on the spectrum you guys are, even though it's not going to be like a perfect fit every single time for everyone. I think they're really, really good tools for generally getting the concept of how someone relates to other people and how you relate to other people, and then how there might be some of those disconnects, especially in relationships and employee-employee relationships, anything like that where there can be tension in a relationship, which is pretty much all relationships. It helps to know where the other person roughly might be coming from. And so I think these tests are really good for that. I don't think they're an exact science, but I think they're really good for that. And they get you close in the ballpark of where people are, which I think what they should be used for. Yeah.
For sure.
I looked it up
really
when
helpful.
I took the test a few weeks ago. It was number 1 that it gave me, but I really don't think reading that description that accurately fits well. But it gave me a number 1 when I took that test a couple weeks ago.
That? What is that?
It's the strict perfectionist.
I don't know, man. I feel like
that resonates.
Yeah, that sounds like you. For
Matthew,
sure.
look at 5. I think that may be a better fit. And I'm by no means an expert, but I just know other 5s that sort of remind me of you.
The quiet specialist. I can see that.
So again, I
can see 5.
David, I like personality stuff. It's fun to sort of dive in. We actually did that a bit with Jeremy and Steve on the 5 voices and the communication code. They kind of break it down. And again, my mind always goes, well, that's so cool. There's 5 things, but there's probably 6 or 7 or 8. Like it's kind of hard to chunk humans into one of 5, rough family trees or traits. So I think it can be, I don't want to say dangerous, but it can be misleading to sort of depend on it and just say, well, I'm a 7, so that's an excuse for all my actions. I think it's just a decent starting point to help you become self-aware and know your tendencies and your patterns, and then sort of have some language to describe yourself. But then ultimately, you're not just a number. You're not just a series of letters. You're a human with infinite possibility and infinite beauty. And so it's a chance to understand yourself, but then to sort of lead a life anyway.
It is weird though. I feel like with the personality test, you see this a lot. Like everything in life is a dichotomy to some point. But we are very unique and different, but yet we're not as unique and different as we always think. Like you said, Caleb, people do generally fall into different categories. And I think it's everyone kind of has an eye-opening experience the first time they do one of these tests, one of the good tests for these. And then you read the description and it's like, man, someone jump inside my head. Like I couldn't even describe myself this way. Like you read through these sometimes and you're like, this is actually extremely accurate. And sometimes it even answers questions you didn't know about yourself, just reading through like how these people relate to other people. Like, oh, that makes sense now. And so we are all different. We are all unique. But sometimes I don't think we're quite as different and unique as we think we are. A lot of people do generally fall into some pretty specific categories. And I think these are pretty good at pulling out some of those sometimes.
You mean I'm not a special snowflake?
You are your own special snowflake.
Okay.
That's what we tell you, right?
Yeah.
So I want to go back, though, to something you said, Caleb, not to get too off track, but something you mentioned about how people figure out these habits and routines and frameworks in our lives. And I liked what you said. It's almost our duty to share these with other people once we discover what works for us. And I really like that. And I was kind of thinking about the same concept this week. We were doing, we have a weekly like small group we meet with. And this week we're reading through 1 Corinthians, and I was talking about the gifts of the Spirit and the different things that each person is kind of the gifts that they're given. And I don't know why I read this. I've read this verse a lot of different times and read the gifts of the Spirit a lot, but it kind of hit me a different way this time when I read through and it's like wisdom, understanding, counsel, fortitude, knowledge. And I started thinking about those. And for some reason, I'd always thought about those gifts as like inward gifts, like that's a gift for me. But all of those gifts only work if there's something you have that you're sharing with someone else. Like counsel, it does no good if you have the gift of counsel, but you keep it to yourself. It only helps if you're actually going out and serving others or counseling others, all these different things. And it relates back to these habits, like having great routines and stuff like that. If we're not sharing those and helping other people, we're not really being near as constructive as we could be and near as beneficial for society as a whole. When we find these things that work, these frameworks, these habits, I really do think duty is the right word. It's our duty to share these with other people and to not hold these in for ourselves. And so I really like that all of our guests have been willing to do that, put themselves out there, share what they've learned and share these for other people. And I know people get tied up in numbers a lot, and it's easy to see social media posts with 1 million views and stuff like that. But we've talked about this with our past live streams is sometimes we're disappointed when we do a live stream and see, oh, there's 31 people on watching today. Like it was only 31 people. But you think of a room of 31 people, like that's actually a decent amount of people in one room. And think about 4 people actually listening to what you're saying and 1 person actually putting it into action. Like that's a huge thing, even if it's only 30 people in the room. And so thinking about all of our guests and the frameworks they've shared and the habits they've shared and all of the people that have listened to these episodes, if even a handful of people put those into practice, that's a pretty big difference in the world when you look at the grand scheme of things. And so, that was just eye-opening. I like that you called that out, talked about our duty to share what we've learned. I think that's a really good way of putting it.
Well, I think the more true it is, or the more it resonates, or the more it serves people, if there's demand for it, then those are sort of the ones that blow up and become a bestseller book or a best-selling blog or whatever that may be. And again, it is hard to look at stuff when you go, man, the number of views aren't there, or the likes or the clicks or the actions aren't maybe what I'd want them to be. But I think, like David and I've talked about this a lot, even when you're not there, Matthew, is how do we follow our curiosities and we make it something that we love to do? And if we do that and we're genuinely passionate, curious, and excited about what we're doing, then the results kind of just take care of themselves. And when you can decouple or disengage from the results, I think that frees you up to do some of the creative work and crafting something that matters.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, as we wind down season 1, I do think it's interesting. I know history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the Books and Bourbon podcast we did back in the Amazon days went 30 episodes. And our first season of Stacking Habits, we're going to put a pin in it here and wind down after 30. This is technically episode 29, but we did lead off with episode 0. So that puts us right at 30 weeks, 30 episodes. And I don't know what it is about 30, but that just tends to be our stopping point as the 3 of us. And as we do that, we are going to take a brief pause, but we'll also be making a change. And one of our members is going to be stepping away. So Matthew.
Did I get voted off the island?
It wasn't a vote. If voting was in play, we would have voted to keep you. We talk about having a diverse team, and I think Matthew, David, and I do have different Enneagrams, but I think we're very similar in a lot of our ways in terms of how we approach other people and how we approach interviews. And Matthew, your skill sets and what you bring to the table. And I think you are, what was the phrase you used on Enneagram 5? A quiet,
Oh, what was it? It was
forget what that phrase was, but that was spot on.
The quiet specialist.
The quiet specialist. You do a lot of things so well, from editing and SEO, and you tend to ground me, at least. I tend to go off with 30 ideas and want to try them all. And you're very practical and sort of rein me in. So I really appreciate you talk about the spectrums. I think you're on a very opposite side than me. And I can speak for myself and probably David to say that you really help sort of round out our team. So you're going to be missed greatly. Do you want to share a bit? Because I really appreciate the thought that you put into it. I know it was hard for you to come to that decision, but do you want to share a little bit about that just with the audience? Because I think that framework and sort of how you recognized it was time to make a change, I think that might resonate with people listening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for those kind words. I did hear that you said I was on the spectrum, but other than that, thanks for the kind the kind words. But yeah, so it was a hard decision to make. There's a few things that made me make this decision. Number one is something that we've contemplated from the very beginning, and we knew from the very beginning, is like 3 hosts for a podcast is a lot. So that's something we kind of all knew going into this. We kind of had it for Books and Bourbon 2, and then going into this. And 3 hosts, especially in a remote setting, just a lot of people to have on one thing with guests, especially if there's 2 guests and then 5 people in the room, and try not to talk over each other. And so for the whole time, I've known that in my mind, like 3 hosts is a lot. The other thing that kind of stuck out to me, and this is probably the biggest thing that made me make this decision, is that even though I can enjoy listening to remote podcasts, and even though I like hearing different guests and their opinions and stuff like that, being on a remote podcast and doing interviews remotely just doesn't resonate with me near as much as it does in person. And I had the kind of hard realization that if we hit our numbers we wanted to, if we had hundreds of thousands of viewers, if I was doing remote interviews every single week, would that be something I would look forward to and be happy with? And it was just not something that really appealed to me, especially because coming on to point number 3, when we were doing all these episodes, one of my favorite parts of these episodes was kind of sitting back and listening to David and Caleb connect with our guests and relate to them and ask great questions. And so often I found myself as a listener on the podcast sitting back listening and forgetting to even chime in because I was having so much fun listening to the podcast. And so I think David and Caleb, you guys have an extraordinary gift for connecting with guests, for finding great guests, for interviewing them. And like I told you guys, if you guys ever want to move to Phoenix and do an in-person podcast, we'll build a studio. I'll build it in my backyard. We can do in-person episodes. I would love to do that. But I just thought it was time, especially coming up on the end of this first season of Stacking Habits. I really want to focus in on one thing and devote all my time and attention to that. And I just knew it wasn't going to be the podcast at this point. And so that's why I chose to step away and let Caleb and David run with it and really take off from here.
Thanks for sharing that. I know that's hard to put you on the spot and share that, but I really respect your opinion. I know that wasn't easy to arrive at it. And I just got back from the Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting. Charlie Munger passed away earlier, I think late last year in December, and he was 99. Warren Buffett's 93. And so it was one of those things. I went and saw LeBron James. I've seen Tiger Woods. You kind of want to see the greats in your day. And it was a chance to go see Warren and see how he thinks and how he answers questions. And it was really interesting. He said 2 things that really stood out. They had nothing to do with business. And one of them really applies to what you just said. There was like a 27-year-old that flew in from Thailand to attend the conference, flew 20 plus hours to be here at the event. And he was asking some questions. And one of the pieces of info or advice that Warren gave to him, he said, above all else, follow your curiosity. And so if you're loving something, you tend to get lost in it. It doesn't feel like work. Just do that thing, like whatever direction that takes you. And so I appreciate that about you, Matthew, where you're being self-aware enough to go, man, not that I hate doing this, but there's something that doesn't quite feel right, doesn't quite jive with how I want to show up in the world. And being self-aware enough to admit that and then say, hey, I'm going to do something to change it, even if it's awkward, even if it's hard to, say this to my friends. I really respect that. The other thing he said doesn't necessarily apply here, but I thought it was really interesting. He's, 8th richest man in the world. I think his net worth is about 120 billion, give or take 10 billion. And the most important thing he said at the very end of the conference, he said, guys, everybody out here, just be kind. And Tim Ferriss wraps up every episode of his podcast the same way. He says, be kind to yourself, kind to others. And Warren said, the world doesn't need another rich person. That's great if you can get good at money and figure it out. But the world does need more kind people. And you're going to change the world more by being kind. So I just want to say that as everybody's listening, this will sort of conclude season 1. And David and I are going to take a little bit of a break here and sort of figure out all the missing pieces that Matthew's going to leave behind here, and who's going to edit and how we're going to go about it. But I just want to leave that piece of advice is, one, if you found anything that resonates from the show or even from this episode, write it down, and then by all means, put the darn thing into practice. Because again, ideas are everywhere. They're cheap. I would say execution is really one of the only thing that matters. And then 2 is be kinder, kind to yourself, kind to others. And I think if you do that, and we all do that, then this podcast becomes worth it.